In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, grant us concentration, that we may learn, listen, understand, have a peaceful mind, and remember that you're with us always. Amen. In the last video, we began to look a little closer at evolution, with maybe a closer look at macroevolution in the process in which new species would develop. And as I mentioned, we would say that Charles Darwin probably would be the father of this process, as the description of evolution as being the result of variation and natural selection. That as through time, the variants with the highest fitness were the ones that survived. And so Charles Darwin is our father here of evolution. And he was studying as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle, a ship that went around the world, sailing out of the British Islands down the east coast of South America, then up around the west coast. And most of his observations that we're going to talk about come during his time where he's working at the Galapagos Islands, a set of islands about 550 miles off the west coast of Ecuador, or the west coast of South America. These are volcanic islands. They were formed by the actions of volcanoes, and so they're sort of isolated from any world around it. And so the animals that were there came across new environments as the islands were beginning to form. They were also isolated from the animals that moved out there from the west coast of Africa, or the west coast of South America. And so what did he find? Well, one of the important notes that Charles Darwin had made about the plants and animals there, and we're going to refer specifically to the finches, the group of birds that were present on there, is that he had found this process of adaptive radiation occurring. And what we mean by adaptive radiation, if we look at the words, is that means that as the animals move out, as they radiated from the source, from one island to the next, or from the mainland to the islands, they began to adapt to the environment that they found there. And the adaptations, or the phenotypes that were favored in a particular area, may have been different than in other areas. And so as they moved out, as they radiated out, they adapted to these new environments. And the example that shows this the best was Darwin's finches. And so he found a group of finches, a number of different species of birds that were present on the Galapagos Islands, that had evolved unique characteristics based on their location in the islands. Now, he was able to conclude that as a result of the similarities to species on the mainland of South America, they all were likely originally one species that made its way to the island. As they moved from the islands, some of the animals found very large seeds that they could eat, and so they developed these large beaks. Some of them found smaller seeds, so they had more delicate beaks that were able to grab and pick up the small seeds that were present there. And so whatever was the most abundant food source favored the selection for that. Some of them didn't have seeds to eat, but some of them were eating buds, and so they had these parrot-like or cutting type beaks that were formed there. Some of them were insect eaters, but again, variation there depending on what type of insect they were eating. Larger, smaller, more diverse types of beaks that were found. And so Darwin began to conclude from this that the variation was present, the difference in the size and the shape of the beaks was present. But as they moved out through the islands, they adapted to the most abundant food source, and whichever animal within the population had the advantage of the best food source continued to show the traits. And so over time they evolved, and they eventually became separate species because they were so different from each other that they were isolated and could no longer reproduce with each other. And so this is the the concept of adaptive radiation, moving out from that. And so Darwin was able to show this using the finches, and we see a lot of other examples. Now, for Darwin to begin to talk about evolution or natural selection and how it occurs, there were three criteria that were critical for his to understand how this process is occurring. First, there must be variation. There must exist variation among the species, or between the species, or initially within the species. If there is no variation within the species, there's no opportunity for change or selection to form a new species. Variation must lead to differences among the individuals. In other words, the genetic variation that's present in the animal must have a phenotypic reflection also. And this difference, the genetically transferable to the next generation. In other words, there must be some advantage for a certain phenotype, which would have a genetic basis, which would be more likely to pass alleles to the next generation, and so on and so forth, eventually changing the species or changing the organism to become a new species. And so this is natural selection. This is the process by which we can observe evolution occurring over time. So as I've already mentioned, we sort of divide evolution into two types, macroevolution and microevolution. Well, within the natural world, we can also see another sort of definition or a way to define evolution, and that's different types of evolution. And so what we've been talking about so far would be considered divergent evolution. And divergent evolution is simply evolution from a parent species to form distinct daughter species. Okay? So you start with one parent species, and as it changes over time, you're going to see different characteristics, different qualities that are forming in those species, eventually leading to some sort of isolation that makes them a unique species. And so the examples we've looked at so far are this idea of divergent species. As animals living in different areas develop unique traits, they become more and more different. Darwin's finches are a great example of that. If there was one parent species of finch that came to the Galapagos Islands, as they moved out, radiated out to the different areas, they adapted unique qualities based on how they were using the ecosystem and eventually became separate species. So that's divergent evolution. Now, both convergent and parallel evolution are very similar, but they're going to start with the same premise. They start with two distinct parent species, and this isn't going to form one species, but we see the evolution of the species over time. Either it's going to form species that have very similar traits, okay? The characteristics of the animals become more and more similar because of the common use of the ecosystem. Or because they're going to develop similar traits, not necessarily becoming more and more alike, but they develop or evolve along the same lines, even though they're completely different species. And that's parallel evolution. So we're going to look at some examples of each to sort of differentiate between these. What I want to start with talking about what evidence do we have for the process of evolution occurring. And so this is mostly going to refer to divergent evolution, but we could use it for convergent or parallel too. But with respect to divergent evolution, what are some examples? Artificial selection. So humans selecting for that. As I show with the corn here, the precursor of corn tenosite, teosinoite. Teosinoite was a precursor grain that was found, and it had the kernels that would look familiar to us as a corn, but what we would consider the cob was very loose, very small, contained very few kernels. Over time, as people selected for larger and larger cob size, you ended up evolving the corn to form what we would consider modern corn. Large cobs, lots of kernels per cob, very high produce. They also showed differences in some of the nutritional qualities of these corns. So artificial selection, agricultural selection in this case, was one example. Another example are pets. So dogs evolved from the wolf. But we have a large different variety of dogs that have been selected for over the years that have led to dramatic differences between them. Between the Mastiff, very large dog, very strong dog, good for hunting, good for protection, down to lap dogs like the Chihuahua, very small dog that was selected for its particular traits. And so this form of selection, artificial selection, gives us evidence that the process of evolution is occurring. We also see this in the fossil record. And so what is a fossil? A fossil is a preserved remain of a previously living organism. These are commonly found in the areas where the animals die and they become preserved in the earth. For the most part, what we see are bones or other solid type structures that will be retained over time. Sometimes we see areas such as the tundra where they can become permanently frozen in the soil, or tar pits where there's these active areas, or amber where insects may get stuck in amber. There is possibility to see the organism's soft tissue too. Now, how does this show? Well, this shows how the species change over time because we can date how old certain are. So we can do relative dating, and I would say can do this by looking at the stratification. And what stratification basically says is the deeper you dig into the ground, the older the fossils are. And so we know fossils near the surface we would expect to be newer or less old, whereas the deeper you go, the older and the older the fossils are. So fossils found near the surface are going to be younger than the fossils that are found below that, and below those are even older. This is a relative dating in that we can say there's going to be a possibility of this. Now, with the process of earthquakes, erosion, movement of soils, there's always the possibility of mixing up the layers. A more accurate mechanism would be radioactive dating. And so radioactive dating is using the rate of decay of the radioisotopes to be able to determine that. And probably the most common would be carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 over time will decay to form normal or carbon-12. And so we know that carbon-14, half of the amount of carbon-14 present in a particular sample will erode or decay once every 5,700 years, about 5,700 years. And so if I know I start with a sample that contained 1% carbon-14, that if I came back 5,700 years later and picked it out, I'd expect it to have 0.5% of carbon-14. Now, the amount of carbon-14 is much lower than that percentage, but I'm using that as an example. At 11,400 years, we would be down to 0.25%. So it's the ratio of the amount of radioactive isotope to normal isotope that will allow you to give a date. And this date is, because we know the half-life, we can call this a pretty absolute date. Now there are some issues. The amount of radioisotope is fairly low, and so detection of these radioisotopes may be difficult. Another limitation is that we assume with this that the ratio of isotopes has remained constant over time. May or may not be true, but this does give us a chance to be able to determine with some confidence how old a sample is. And so fossil evidence begins to show us this. What are some of the things that we can see in the fossil record? Well, we can see transition states. These are animals that maybe only lasted a short time, weren't around for very long, but show some examples of the presence of sort of intermediate or transitional states. An example of this is the Archaeopteryx. And the Archaeopteryx is a fossil which was discovered in the 1850s, and it shows a reptilian-like animal with feathers. This was originally thought to show the transition state between dinosaurs and birds, so some of the large birds on Earth were thought to originally have been dinosaurs. It's now more likely that it's the other way, where the large bird species evolved into reptiles, into dinosaurs. And I'll make the argument a little later this semester that really all the dinosaurs were avian species. T-Rex is a big turkey. And there is some evidence to support that. Other transitional states we see, for example, with the whale, where we go from a terrestrial animal that had short legs to a sort of amphibious animal that could live on land or in the water, to an animal that was dependent on the water but still showed hind limbs and forelimbs that have similarities, to finally the modern toothed whales, the killer whale that we're showing here, in which we see no longer have an active rear limb, and they're showing the transformation, the changes in the forelimbs. So these transition states, by dating them, give us some time frame through which this process of change is occurring. A great example of this from the fossil record is the modern horse. And so we think of the modern horse, equus, as being these large grazing animals with hooves that allows them to avoid predation by being able to run very fast in one direction, so they can outrun the predators that are coming after them. Straight line running, large body size are forms of protection. We also know that they have flat teeth. These flat teeth are used for grinding grasses, which is typical of grazers. As we begin to look at the related species that have been discovered over time, we see the precursor of the modern horse was a much smaller animal that lived in the forest, so it had soft padded feet that allowed it agility to move around trees, move around large plants, to be able to avoid predation. We also see with the shape of the tooth that the shape of the tooth is more for cutting rather than grazing. And so these were browsers. Browsers are animals that eat the ends of trees or ends of limbs, and they need to be able to cut those. And so in both the size, the type of foot, and the tooth shape, we see the process of evolution occurring to lead to the modern horse, which is easily recognizable now. So again, we're looking at evidence of divergent evolution. There's a change in the species over time that have led to the modern horse. Some of the other evidence for evolution we see is anatomical evidence. And so if we look for among mammals, we see homologous structures. That is, structures that are the same type of bone, but have changed over time to have the unique function needed for that particular animal. So if we look at the forelimbs, we see from a human, a cat, a bird, a porpoise, and a horse, we see the same alignment of structures with starting at the fingers with the phalanges, metacarpals, carpals, ulna and radius in the forearm, and humerus in the upper arm. But each of these have adapted slightly different characteristics that allow them to perform the function they need. For example, the bat have elongated phalanges with the webbing between them that allow them to elevate themselves and fly. Whereas the horse, we see compaction of the metacarpals and the phalanges to form what will be the leg and the foreleg and the hoof to allow for running. Another example is shown in vestigial tissues. Vestigial tissues are tissues that have had an apparent function in the past, but for some reason or another are retained. And an example of this is shown in the ends of the manatee. Manatee flippers have apparent fingernail-like structures on them. Obviously, they don't have fingers anymore, but the retaining these particular structures provide evidence of a relationship there. And so these are anatomical evidences of convergent or divergent evolution, where we see these differences. We can also find examples of convergent and parallel evolution as being present too. So the ocean predators show us an example of convergent evolution. So these are completely unique species. They're never going to reproduce. We have a cartilaginous fish, the shark. We have a bony fish in the tuna. We have a reptile in the ichthyosaurus. And we have a dolphin, which is a mammal. And we see that each of these have developed these similar characteristics, even though they're never going to reproduce together. We have elongated bodies. We have strong tail fins that allow for movement through the water. And we have these dorsal fins that allow for directional movement. And so they've all evolved to have these similar characteristics, even though they're very different types of animals, and they're never going to reproduce amongst. They're not forming one species, they're simply taking on similar characteristics based on their use of the environment. Similarly, we see the same thing when we talk about parallel evolution. And as I said, parallel evolution is similar in that we have the evolutionary process occurring, but in this case, it's the development of common traits based on the similar environment. But these animals are separated. They're never even going to come close to each other. And so we have marsupials in Australia that show very similar characteristics to the placental animals that have similar roles. So the placental, or the marsupial mole, is small, tubular shape, you could say, poor eyesight, good digging ability, very strong scent of smell to be able to find its prey, to be able to continue to eat. Anteaters, they have developed similar characteristics, whether it's a marsupial or a placental, and we could go through the other examples, but hopefully you can see here. They're evolving along the same lines, even though they're completely separated. So a mole in western Pennsylvania is going to have similar characteristics to a mole in Australia, even though that mole in Australia happens to be a marsupial. And so this is, again, an example of parallel evolution where we're seeing changes over time. I'm going to stop this video here, having gone through the different processes of evolution. I want to pick up the next video to begin to look at the process of speciation. As always, thank you for watching this video. If you have questions, please contact me through Schoology or via email, and I will answer those questions as quickly as I can. Thank you.